The two most significant events, in my mind at least, in the spiritual history of the last 100 years were in reverse order, reverse chronological order. In 1945, the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Gnostic Library of Documents in Egypt, and the other in the latter part of the 19th century of the remarkable HPB Blavatsky and her work. It was Madame Blavatsky's contention that Western culture at that time was about to be broken by two terrible soul-killing inimical forces. One, materialism. Second, a materialized, hardened, dogmatic religiosity. Working from her intuitive sources and resources without the support of any kind of academic evidence available to us today, virtually single-handedly against the greatest odds and overwhelming opposition, she asserted two propositions which were momentous in their implications and at the same time by no means popular with any of the establishments, academic or religious, of her day. And these were, first of all, that humans were not mere fortuitous concurrences of particles of physical matter, and secondly, that humans were not mere slave creations of a capricious creator God. With the first of these, she pitted herself against the so-called scientific establishment of her day, with the second one against the religious establishment. In denying these two propositions, she came to state that humans are conscious outpourings of an ultimate transcendental reality, sparks of a central super-terrestrial and super-celestial flame. Some 600 years before, in certain parts of Europe, and even earlier, in the early part of the century, in the early part of the Christian era, the Gnostics of Alexandria and other Mediterranean localities stated very much the same thing. In the course of our discussion now, we will investigate in basic outline form the remarkable convergences that exist between the worldview of the ancient Gnostics on the one hand and of HPB Blavatsky on the other, in the following 7 specific areas. First, the point of the spirit, known in Greek as pneuma, within the human, and its present condition of sleep and its potential awakening. This is the great Gnostic symbol and metaphor of Adam being asleep in paradise. The true man, the true human being, is asleep within us and is in need of awakening. The second point, the nature and role of myth as the agency whereby transcendental insight is both awakened and conveyed. The third, the Gnostic and Theosophic God concept. Fourth, the flawed nature of the manifest world and the presence of evil. Fifth, the figure of the feminine aspect of deity known to the Gnostics as Sophia. Sixth, the paradigmatic nature of the Christian messianic figure of Jesus and its archetypal higher aspect known as the Christ. And seventh, HPB's specific references to certain Gnostic teachings as present in some Gnostic scriptures that were available to her at that time, notably in Pistis Sophia. If indeed, after reviewing these, we still have any time left, then we will take a brief look at certain suggestions regarding what I like to call a Gnostic approach to theosophy. According to the aforementioned Gnostic scholar Quispel, Gnosticism expresses a specific mystical or religious experience which it then turns into myth. I have stated on other occasions here and elsewhere that indeed I consider this characteristic as the veritable dividing line, the veritable watershed that distinguishes Gnostic or Gnosticizing thought and systems from the systems of the mainstream. The alternative reality tradition, which we spoke about this morning, is primarily distinguished by this, that unlike the mainstream religious traditions, which turn transcendental spiritual experience into belief on the one hand and commandments on the other, the alternative tradition, of which theosophy is a part, has always had a predominant tendency to turn such experience into myth instead. Myth and the mythological approach to spirituality has received a great deal of interest and is receiving an increasing amount of publicity in our day, largely as the result of the work of Joseph Campbell. One needs to recognize, however, that Campbell is only the latest remaining exponent of a school in that regard, which was largely inspired by Jung. And so after having been labeled a synonym for untruth, for falsehood or a lie for years upon years, myth is now increasingly recognized as what Joseph Campbell defined it, a metaphor transparent toward transcendence. Indeed, in many instances, the only feasible way in which transcendental, mystical, theosophic, Gnostic experience can be made available and whereby experience can become to a certain extent repeatable. I might say in that respect that it's very peculiar and strange, I'm sure, to all of us, but we theosophists seem to be in the main subject to a great many of the afflictions of other people. It ought not to be that way. If we are subject to afflictions and foibles, they ought to be unique. So we really should work on that. It's unfortunate. But one of the ways in which this came to my attention some time ago, and I was at a large and really very impressive theosophical meeting somewhere, where the entire series of discussions for a couple of days concerned myths and mythology. And there were some very good presentations made, no doubt the best being my own. But actually there were some others that were pretty good. And when it was all over, then there was a discussion. And in the course of this, a large number of the participants were asked, what is a myth? And one after the other, they still spouted the old line that a myth is a lie. not because they had no sympathy for what we were saying, but because the indoctrination along this line, the long-standing, unfortunate definition has been so ingrained that it is very difficult, even with much evidence to the contrary, to disentangle one's mind from that. Whatever the case may be, there is a powerful move at the present time for such a disentanglement to take place. And so we can see that the approach in this regard, so powerfully represented by the Gnostics, is now being rediscovered. And that this is definitely a salutary phenomenon to which we need to relate ourselves. Now, looking at the works of Madame Blavatsky, we find that when it comes to her attitude toward myth, we find a curious paradox. On the one hand, there can be little doubt that the author of the secret doctrine is a magnificent myth maker herself, and that all of her works possess mythic power and an impact independent of, and often probably more valuable than any factual content could be. I'll share with you a few words of our good friend and fellow member, Professor Robert Elwood of the University of Southern California, who in one of his works wrote about the secret doctrine. This was written for a school, for university textbook, by the way. The Secret Doctrine is a book not easily forgotten, even by those who despise it, or who, like many outside the theosophical orbit, find it almost impossible to read. To understand what it has to offer, one must learn how to read it. The Secret Doctrine is not a textbook, but is like an ocean with waves and currents and eddies and whirlpools and quiet caves. It calls for suspending one's normal mode of conceptual progress until one has discovered where the tides and techniques of this new medium will carry him. Water is to man a distorting element, and probably whatever he sees in it will not be seen as it really is. The ecstatic surges in his body as he rides the swells will not be forgotten after he has found his feet once again on the sand. Like riding the waves or like listening to great music, this book takes one to where he can perceive reality in new configurations that unite the subjective and the objective. It does not so much convey specific fact as arrange science, myth, philosophy, and poetic narrative in peculiar combinations which can generate remarkable experiences, or so it has been with Theosophists. Thus wrote Robert Elwood concerning the Secret Doctrine. What may one call such an arrangement of various motifs, as he puts it, in peculiar combinations which generate remarkable experiences? What else can one call it but a myth as employed in a Gnostic manner? Certainly the writings of such ancient Gnostic teachers as Valentinus and Basilides could be described in very similar words. Some additional comments by Elwood might also be useful. As one grows into the world of the Secret Doctrine, one understands more and more that it presents a psychological model of the cosmos. The more its vision is comprehended and interiorized, the more the reader shares the workings of universal consciousness. This brings up another curious circumstance, which I think many of us have been and are unwilling to fully acknowledge. And that is what to me is the patent fact circumstance that every occultist, and that includes Theosophists, worth his or her salt, is a romantic, be they aware of this or not. Whether they are called William Blake or Eliphas Levi or Madame Blavatsky or before them Valentinus and Basilides and others, all such people were primarily concerned not with passing on factual information, but with engendering, well, engendering what? A majestic feeling, a majestic sense of wonder and awe. The kind of majestic wonder that one glimpses to some extent and perhaps to a minor degree in sunsets and grand landscapes and fairy tales and ancient legends, and of course to a major degree in great art and in the experience of the transcendence of the spirit. But what we need to remember is that in Madame Blavatsky's day, feeling, emotion, was not regarded as an experience to be cherished, to be cultivated, to be engendered. She lived in an age when especially the so-called intelligentsia was convinced that humanity was on the last important ladder of some kind of evolution, which would make us totally intellectual beings. Humanity was envisioned by the Victorian intelligentsia rather like that noted archetype that all of us are familiar with, Humpty Dumpty. A great big head from which are suspended sort of tiny little feet and hands, but it is basically a head. And so there was no word in the dictionary in the 19th century or in the dictionary of the 19th century intellectuals for something called by Robert Elwood a psychological model of the cosmos. What was Blavatsky to do? She was in the process of rehabilitating and bringing back onto the stage of the world an approach to reality that was literally antagonistic to the worldview of the normative forces of the culture at that time. She had to bring the ancient gnosis back into the culture, frequently by way of the back door, as it were. One way or the other, she said, it must happen. The wisdom of the gods has to be brought back into the world. One of her expressions for it was, I believe, by spirit hook or bishop's crook. Now, whether it in a spiritualistic guise or in a religious guise, it has to happen. She saw the restoration of the ancient mystico-magical worldview as a crucial necessity. The means mattered less than the fact that it ought to be done. And so she did the best she could. In her work, Isis Unveiled, for instance, she wrote, one quotation, "Myth was the favorite and universal method of teaching in archaic times." No Campbell or Mircea Eliade could disagree with that. Another quotation also from Isis, "Fairy tales do not exclusively belong to nurseries. All mankind, except those few who in all ages have directly comprehended their hidden meaning, and tried to open the eyes of the superstitious, have listened to such tales in one shape or other, and after transforming them into sacred symbols, called the product religion. Compare this with a, by now I think, fairly well-known statement of Joseph Campbell, where he said, religion is myth misunderstood. I don't think Campbell was channeling Blavatsky, but he could have. Another quotation also from Isis: there are few myths in any religious system, but have a historical, a scientific, and a spiritual foundation. Myths are now found to be fables, just in proportion as we misunderstand them, truths in proportion as they were once understood. And lastly, and most important, hedging a bit and careful, she came to admit even that her presentation of the ancient wisdom, her theosophy, also had heavy mythic overtones. That was a difficult thing to admit. Remember, she was talking to people who considered a myth a lie. And yet she wrote, to some extent, we must admit that even the esoteric teaching is allegorical. To make the latter comprehensible to the average intelligence, the use of symbols cast in an intelligible form is always needed. Hence, the allegorical and mythical narratives in the exoteric and the only semi-metaphysical and objective representations in the esoteric teachings. For the purely transcendentally spiritual conceptions are adapted only to the perceptions of those who, and now she quotes some other source, see without eyes, hear without ears, and sense without organs. So there is very little doubt then that the enunciator of the modern theosophical mythic system was an expert mythmaker herself, who, in spite of the unsympathetic intellectual climate of her day, recognized the Gnostic function and the value of the myth, and who was gently and carefully introducing her readers and followers to the controversial concept of the possible mythic and symbolic character of her teachings. After all, we must remember that HPB Blavatsky took the very name of the system that she brought forth, that she enunciated, from the Neoplatonists, who, along with other people in that particular era, always distinguished between at least three different levels of apprehension. The lowest and the least important of these was always considered to be the knowledge of facts. According to Neoplatonism, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, factual knowledge was not considered very important. It was the lowest kind of knowledge. Modern psychology, in a certain sense, would tend to agree, because we know, for instance, we might even say we know it for a fact, that our short-term memory, which is oriented toward facts, is always the first one to go, for whatever reason. Whether it is because of old age, or because you have spent a little bit too much time and effort in the neighborhood bar, probably not a consideration that is very powerfully represented here, or for whatever reason, your mind itself says that factual knowledge doesn't matter all that much. Let's forget it. And it forgets it first. The other kind of long-range and more complicated memory, it does not drop that quickly. The next level of apprehension and understanding after fact was considered to be truth. Truth in the philosophical sense. truth as revealed by philosophic mental processes, by logic, by syllogisms, and so forth. And then there was still a third one, which was considered to be the highest of all, and this was reality, the apprehension of reality beyond fact and beyond truth. Blavatsky obviously was aware of these things, but she had to treat them with care in order to have at least some kind of a at least partially favorable public response. So we can say on the first and important point, I think, that Blavatsky was indeed a myth maker, that she knew that, and that she carefully expressed that position. She is very much at one with the old Gnostics in that, and with the kind of new view now that is arising as the result of mythological studies and otherwise. Another very important point, which I will treat more briefly, has to do with the concept of the divinity, of the godhead. Some people, not without justification, call Blavatsky a kind of a god killer. She was certainly not kind to the Judeo-Christian God. She called him all kinds of names. She even said, again, not without some justification, that the Judeo-Christian God, Jehovah, is none other than Satan. No one since the Qatar Gnostics in the 1200s and 1300s had made that identification. Blavatsky did. And it will not do to put her attacks against the God image of the Judeo-Christian Islamic monotheistic system down to mere bluster and a kind of dramatic anti-Christian extremism. Yes, she knew how to use drama. She was drama incarnate, God bless her. And in order to make an impact in her time against religious orthodoxy, she felt that often she had to say and write some very dramatic, some very extreme things. But in her attitude toward the God image of monotheistic culture, she worked from another basis, exactly the same basis which served as the foundation of the Gnostic God image. She felt, even as the ancient Gnostics and Hermeticists did, that the monotheistic God cannot be, by definition, the true and ultimate God. That beyond the personal deities, whether they be called Jehovah or Allah or by any other name, there is an ultimate, impersonal, transpersonal deity, a divine field out of which all things come, and that the many indications of personal capriciousness, vengefulness, and other limiting qualities that have been ascribed to the monotheistic deity are a corruption and do not pertain to the ultimate God. The Gnostics always said, within the context of the Christian mythos, that Jehovah was not the father of Jesus. That Jehovah was a demiurge, a being interposing itself between the ultimate true deity. And even as Paul Tillich came to state at a later period, we need to recognize the God above God. Modern depth psychology, beginning with Freud, who was not a man without insights, although we may not share all of his positions, made a powerful case for the incalculable damage done to the psyche of our culture by the flawed image of God, which is present in the monotheistic religions. We have been created in the image and the likeness of a false and flawed deity by our religions. And we are literally hag-ridden by the inconsistencies, the radical inconsistencies in the character of our God. And this is a difficulty that somehow needs to be undone in our culture, and has not been effectively undone up to this time. For a while, the solution to many people, and some very fine and very well-intentioned and very high-minded people, was to become atheists. The only way that they could get away from this extremely difficult, internally inconsistent, insane God was to simply deny that he exists. This is particularly true of the greatest intellectual and spiritual flowering of the Jewish people, because they received, let's say, the unfavorable impact of that God image even more directly and with greater force than Christians did. But by now I think we have come to learn that atheism is not the solution. Something else must happen. Well, the indications are here. Blavatsky has outlined it for us 100 years ago and earlier. We have to recognize that there is another kind of, it's perhaps not even the right thing to say concept, but another kind of reality of the divine than the limited monotheistic God we have learned about. And that if we really can come into contact with that, not just as an idea, not just as a concept, but as a reality, if the God above God, the God beyond God, can become a reality to us once again, then the dark stamp placed upon our culture by this difficult God concept may be removed, and there may be a tremendous redemption that could come about. Once again, as far as I'm able to tell from my studies, the last time that this position was held with the same kind of force, the same kind of clarity, the same kind of uncompromising insight before Blavatsky was by the Gnostics in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. A very, very important convergence. One of the extremely important aspects of Gnostic wisdom, which of course is increasingly being explored now for good reasons of the interest of the culture, is the mythic figure of Sophia, the wisdom woman, the daughter of the fullness, who is really in many ways the creator behind the outward creator in the Gnostic myths. So the divine in its feminine manifestation was represented by the ancient Gnostics as being intimately connected with the creation of the material world and of the human being. And Sophia, the divine wisdom woman, was regarded as the true mother of the world and the mother of humanity. In Isis Unveiled, HPB, this is a very early source, refers to Sophia, and here is a little sort of recension of her statements about that. Let me make that quite quick. The wise daughter of the fullness, said HPB, who is called Sophia, is in reality the mother of the blind and rebellious Jehovah Satan, called here Yalda Baoth. who in defiance of his mother has bungled the job of creation and merely fashioned a flawed world in the image of his own flaws. These are primarily HPB's words as I collected them together. Humans, said HPB in ISIS, unlike the monstrous abortions whereby Jehovah peopled the earth, have within them the spark of the divine light, which allows them to communicate with Sophia and through her with the infinite light. This continuous seeking of human souls for their true source enrages Jehovah and impels him to attempt to destroy humanity. All of this is recounted very much as I have here summarized it by HPB in ISIS Unveiled. Now, arising from these considerations, there comes an order, which I think is also very important for us today to contemplate and probably to explore and to amplify. And that is that although many theosophists in later times have come to associate themselves with a kind of Neoplatonic optimism, which delights in a beautiful world filled with evolving life and governed by laws of perfect justice and harmony. When we look at H.P. Blavatsky's writings in depth, we really find a somewhat different picture. Some literature written for popular consumption by writers of the Theosophic fold might have painted this kind of a rosy picture, but the author of The Secret Doctrine adhered to a different and somewhat darker view. Far from being a totally good world created by a good God, this world, so Blavatsky recognized, is a dark place, weird, flawed, at times even monstrous, and fashioned and managed, at least to a certain extent, by flawed beings who themselves have become radically alienated from the supreme source. I will not give you the whole quotation because time is passing, but in The Secret Doctrine she mentioned that the world of Dhyan Chauhan's archangels, in other words, very, very large, very big divine intelligences, or she said, or whatever they may be named, the works of these beings in the world are, as she put it, and I quote now, these imperfect works are the unfinished production of evolution under the guidance of imperfect gods. Now this is a very, very deep, a very mysterious, and to some people probably very terrifying implication of the ultimate concepts of evolution. So what is meant here is that while along with us, the cosmic managers possibly also are evolving toward higher states of consciousness and perfection, they are no more perfect now than we are. And since they create and manage various cosmic circumstances, we can't expect those cosmic circumstances to be perfect either. And that this is something to face and to understand. Maybe it sounds strange when stated in this particular manner, as I have now stated it. But you know, allowing for certain differences or in culturally determined religious terminology, this is exactly what Buddha said. Buddha in effect said to the people in India, yes, if you want your crops to grow, if you want to have more sons, you want fertility and things like that, then go ahead and pray to the gods in the temples. They can manage things like that. But if you want to be free, if you want to be liberated, if you want to become truly yourself, these gods cannot help you. They are as helpless as you are. They are tied to the great wheel, just like you are. And so what you have to do is rise above that wheel. Get off the cycle of constant coming and going, the fruitless return, the fruitless spinning of a great cosmic mental wheel, which in the last analysis, at least as far as the task of liberation and nirvana is concerned, is really going nowhere. So said the Gnosis of the East through the voice of Gautama the Buddha. So said the Gnostics in ancient times. And so said, no doubt, not with a great deal of emphasis, not very prominently, but nevertheless, so said H.P. Blavatsky. This issue, I feel, and I'll conclude on that point now very soon, is of extreme importance and urgency for us today. I'm in contact, as many of you are who go around lecturing and so forth, with people throughout the country, with the public, and then also in other countries and so forth. And I would say that just over the 10 years or so, there has come about an unprecedented openness toward the facing and the understanding of evil and imperfection in the world, in the public mind. This has been growing over the since the last two world wars. It was very difficult. I only lived through World War II. It was very difficult in the wake of World War II to still believe in a good God in charge of a good world. In fact, it was much easier to say good God. Yeah? That is when C.G. Jung wrote his epochal work, Answer to Job, which deals precisely with this issue. Only maybe a month ago or less, you undoubtedly have all seen it, the miracle of miracles occurred, and there was a cover story in Time magazine on evil. If I read the ripples in the public mind correctly, the evasions of this issue, the euphemisms of 19th and early 20th century vintage will no longer satisfy. Neither will karma satisfy any longer as a totally acceptable explanation. There must be something else. There must be a recognition and a facing of the flawed system within which we live. There is warrant for it in H.P. Blavatsky's writings, and it parallels that of the ancient Gnostics very, very closely. Let me quote another little sentence from Robert Elwood in his book Theosophy. Elwood wrote in commenting on such statements by Blavatsky, whether one thinks of such propositions as literal or only allegorically true, they can meet an existential need dealing with evil, which goes beyond just attributing it to various, quote, laws. Such explanations do not entirely satisfy the rage and despair the world's sufferings evoke. One answer is that the God of this world is at best imperfect, and at worst, these are Elwood's words, so stone him if you wish. He knows how to defend himself, I know him. After all, if you live in Los Angeles and at the University of Southern California for many years, you know something about being stoned. Elwood says, one answer is that the God of this world is at best imperfect and at worst a vindictive, incompetent blunderer, in whose world we, whose true home is in halls of light, far and above his sway, are entrapped, until by following the slow path of evolution and initiation, we free ourselves from his grasp. So here is another important task. How can we, on the basis of Blavatsky's statement of the wisdom tradition, address ourselves creatively to this urgent issue of evil and of the flaw in the world?